The city still smoldered like a memory that refused to cool. Ash threaded the air in soft gray skeins. It dulled the broken spires and laid a pale sheen on the shattered stones. John walked along the blackened quay at dawn, when gulls scissored the light and the tide lifted and lowered the corpses of burned fishing skiffs with a sound like a giant sleeping. The Unsullied had stacked their cargo neatly. Their discipline made order out of ruin. They worked with tight, efficient motions and did not look at him. His boots found the wet boards, the tar and the cinder smell, the dull weight of iron in his chest. Tyrion had told him, in the narrow stone room where light fell in a wedge and dust drifted like tired snow, that the council had decided. Exile to the Night's Watch. Peace was a compromise you could stomach only if you held your breath. John had listened, his back against the cold wall, his mouth tasting of old metal. He remembered the sword going into her, and how her breath had left her like a bird fleeing a broken cage. He remembered the way her hair had smelled of smoke and desert wind, and he remembered the blood, how clean it looked on white stone. He had dreamed of her each night since, and woke feeling empty and wrong, like a man who had cut off his own shadow. On the quay, Grey Worm watched him approach. The commander was like a post driven into the world. Nothing in him moved that didn't need to. "You go to the wall," he said. "I was told," John answered. Grey Worm's gaze slid over him without hatred or anything John could name. Perhaps there was nothing left to name. "The council wishes peace. We wish justice. This is the path between." John looked past him at the water. The black water glittered with bits of ash where the light found them. "I know what peace looks like," he said. His voice came low. "I know what it costs to buy it. I know what it cost you." He thought of Missandei, of her dark eyes on the wall as a queen's word took her neck. He thought of a city crying under fire. "There's another way," he said. "Another way?" Grey Worm asked, the words as flat as an iron plate. "The North will be free," John said. "My sister made it so. There will be no king in Winterfell. But freedom is not a crown you hand to a person. It is a thing you teach. The free folk choose their leaders with their tongues and their feet. The Watch chooses its Lord Commander by voice and by vote. The North has bled for every lord, every wolf and hare and lion that sailed its stone. What if there were no lords to bleed for, not like before? What if they could choose the hand that steers their own lives?" Grey Worm's face did not change, and yet John sensed a shift, like wind tasting a different valley. "Choose?" he said. "From all people?" "From the people that live there," John said. "Farmers and fisherfolk, trappers, merchants, women and men and children who are nearly men. The old gods and the new can watch in equal measure. The North knows cold. The North knows need. Those who know need should choose how need is met." "And what of justice?" Grey Worm asked. "What of the Queen's slaves set free only for their freedom to be a word in your mouth?" John had no answer that would not sound like pleading or pride. He set his eyes on the water again and listened to the chain clank as a crane lifted a barrel. "I killed her," he said, not to provoke, not to excuse, but because the truth was a thorn that had to be named. "I did it because I believed if I did not, there would be no one left to choose anything. If I go into the snow like a dog you have beaten out of your hall, it will not mend that killing. Let there be a different thing laid upon me. Let mercy be the work I owe. Let me go north, not as a punishment you give, but as a debt I know I have. Let me try to build something that does not burn." Grey Worm's eyes shifted from the ships to John. There were planes in the man's face like stone cut by hand. He was young enough to still be forming and old enough to have been hammered flat. "And if your houses will not give what you say?" he asked. "If they tear you and your choice apart? Then they judge me," John said. He did not say that would be a relief some days. He did not say that if it had been only his life to lay on a scale to save the city, he would have put his neck beneath the blade without drama and without hope. "They judge me, but let me go to them first. With letters from the king, if he wishes to write them. With the blessing of your peace. With the chance." The wind stirred the man's cloak. The sea, reading none of it, went on with its long, indifferent breathing. gray worm said, "Her city does not want your letters. Her dead do not read." "No," John said, "but the living do. The living choose. You're sailing for Noth. I won't stop you. I ask only that you don't stop me, or else kill me here." The other's mouth tightened at the word. John had said it on purpose. It flattened choices. It made the world clean. He had not felt clean for a long time. "Kill you," Grey Worm repeated, tasting the weight of the syllables. He seemed to turn inward then, sifting through things only he could see. A girl's laughter near a sea he had never known before he was stolen. A garden word for a place that might not exist anymore. Men who had no cocks and thus no seed and thus no claims except the ones written in their scars. When he looked up, his voice was still flat but less iron. "Your king will write," he said. "He will write that you are allowed to walk across his land and not be cut to pieces by his men. But the promise we made for peace will stand. If you return to the thing you fled, I will take what you have left." He meant exile. He meant the watch. He meant that mercy was a road, not a bench. John bowed his head. "It will be enough," he said. Bran's letter came that evening, as if the ravens had been listening. They were watching, of course. One could not walk without brushing the mind of a boy who had become a tree and a king. Tyrion brought the parchment to him in person, lingering in the door like a servant who did not want to disturb a man at his prayers. John had been lying awake on a pallet in a hall where the ceiling still smelled of smoke. He turned the paper over in his hands, feeling the sand grit under his thumb where the ink had blotted. It was not a long letter and did not pretend to be. Bran's words had the stillness of snow. He acknowledged that the North could govern itself as it wished. He gave safe conduct and protection to anyone traveling under John's seal, short of treason. He closed with a sentence that read like something out of an old god's mouth. "Men forget that choosing is work. Teach them that again." John folded the paper and tucked it inside his jerkin where he kept his spear point of regret. "Tyrion," he said into the half-dark, "do you believe a man can make a thing good if he has himself been made out of wrong choices?" The dwarf's face creased, and in its creases lay 100 jokes he could have told and did not. "We have, all of us, a ledger," he said. "We balance it with whatever coin we can find. I mean..." John hunted for a word that was not one or duty or love. He was tired of the old words. They had been turned like rags. "I mean mercy." Tyrion looked down at his hands, at the ink stains that would never leave. "Mercy is a kind of cunning, I've found," he said softly. "It buys time and silence and space where other strategies spend blood. But if you mean the sort where you forgive yourself, I can't recommend it. It makes men sloppy." John put the letter away. Ghost stirred at his feet and pressed a cold nose against his palm. "I don't mean that kind," he said. The road north was its own answering. He left at dawn with Davos and 3 men Bran had lent time and names to, and Tormund came down from the high wagons a few days later like a bear tumbling out of a tree, roaring his greeting and slapping Jon's shoulder until his teeth rang. They moved through lands where the rivers ran brown with ash that would not settle, and where the small folk in smoky villages looked at them as if a dry storm were passing by. Banners no longer flew on many of the towers. Where the land had been cut too often, it wore bandages of weeds. They passed through the riverlands under wary eyes and crossed the green fork at a place where someone had nailed a pig's skull above a gate. Davos talked with anyone who would talk, taking the weather's measure in a voice that could have been used to sell fish or to soothe a screaming man. And Jon listened and learned how often hunger was a law. He avoided the places where the snow still remembered. He did not go near the tumbled stones of Wintertown yet. He set his face north and kept his hands steady on the reins and did not dream when he slept. The road buckled and healed in patches. The world does not break evenly. They came to Moat Cailin with its long green stink of bog and the old fortress rising like teeth that had survived too many blows. Jon had passed through those teeth once when he first learned what a king might be and that he wanted none of it, and again later when he wore a lord's responsibility like a wet cloak. Now the ruin seemed a threshold to something that had not yet named itself. A flock of geese rose out of the marsh with a clatter like applause. "There are doors made of mud as well as oak," Davos said in his ear. You never see them until you look down. North of the neck, the shadows lengthened in winter's way even though the year had turned. He smelt the clean of pine and the iron of frost that lives in stones no matter the month. The nearer they came to Winterfell, the less he spoke. Ghost went on ahead and returned with twigs in his coat. He watched the old rise of the land with its familiar dips and the far line of woods that had hidden him as a boy when he had no task except the one he invented each morning. He remembered riding back from the wall with a heart that did not know which way to beat. He remembered his father's face in the snow as a secret boy had told him a secret man's truth. The crypts waited under the hill, and the hot springs caroled in their hidden pipes, and the ash that had drifted as far as White Harbor had long since turned to silt and fed the spring wheat. He rode into the yard when the light had just begun to thin and the roof vents exhaled like the city of his childhood talking in its sleep. Sansa was standing with her hands tucked in her sleeves, her hair braided with the tendency toward perfection it had learned over years of hunger. She looked narrower than he remembered and stronger. When she saw him, there was a flicker along her mouth and then it was gone. Her guards were men whose grandfathers had worn stark colors and whose cousins had died for them. Their faces were the color of bark and ice. Your Grace, Jon said, dismounting. Old habits had weight. My brother, Sansa said. Welcome home. She took him into the hall where the light burned warmer and where the new great table, a solid plank of smoky oak cut from a tree the storm had split, still smelled of sap. The furs on the benches were thick and the benches had more legs than comfortable fashion required. Wolves' heads stared from the carving at the beams. It should have made Jon's heart settle. Didn't. It beat faster, as if the room were a trap that could spring at any breath if he turned wrong. They stood a long moment with the table between them. She was the first to speak. You are not wearing black, she said. Not yet, he answered. You intend not to wear it, she said, the question smoothed flat so that a yes could land on it without injury. I intend to ask something, he said. You'll not like the shape of it. I rarely like the shapes men bring me, she said with a ghost of warmth that went quickly. But I listen. She lifted one hand. Not here. She led him down a passage. To the small hall the Starks had used when they wanted to be heard by their own voices. In the corner the heart of the castle ticked and the floor said winter without a word. He told her there, with the steam rising faint from the stones in a way that made them alive. He told her he wanted to call a great assembly, not of lords only but of the people. She looked sharply at that word, which no one here had made a habit of using as anything but a count, and that he wanted to bring free folk from beyond the wall into the same circle with bannermen from Barrowton and White Harbor and Last Hearth's remnant and the scattered fires that were the Karstarks now. He wanted them to decide, not simply advise, what law would be and how grain would be measured and which roads were to be mended first. He wanted a charter that gave each village leave to choose 2 speakers, 1 man or 1 woman or both, each house a single voice, the free folk a number set by the count of tents they raised that winter, and the watch a voice because it stood like a bone in all of it. He wanted trial by jury drawn from the commons. He wanted to forbid the buying of justice. He wanted all men to stand equal before that law in a way that meant something beyond the right to hang. He wanted to be the one to convene it and not the one to rule it. He finished and there was a quiet that felt like dawn before you know there will be a day. Sansa stood with her hand on the bench back, her fingers very still. When she finally spoke, she did not scream. She did not laugh. I have a crown, she said, and in her voice was faith and weariness and a trace of pain. I did not buy it with love. I bought it with ashes that were once our brothers, and with careful words, and with hunger I made into patience. You said you would wear black. I will wear what is needed, Jon said. What you describe is... She stopped. She could not make her mouth say the word. He said it for her. Choice. Chaos. It can be, Jon admitted, if men make it so. But you have seen what a single will can do when it seizes a thing and names it destiny. We have bled under such men and women. If the North is to be the North as you claimed her to be at the council, if she is to stand, let her stand as a thing made of many bones. Not my arm, not yours. Let her walk because her people move her. They are not used to it, Sansa said. They will not know how. They used to know. They remember in their bones. Before kings there were moots. Before banners, there were fires where men spoke and decided who would lead them over frozen rivers and who would bait the bears. The free folk have it still. The watch has the way of it. They will learn again. He looked at her, at the line of her jaw. I will not take your crown, he said, and let the words hang until they hurt his mouth. I am not asking to be king by another name. Let the assembly choose a speaker or a first steward to carry out its decisions. Let that be an office that rises and falls with vote. Let your crown be a symbol metal speaks to men who need to see their history, and let the law the assembly writes be the hand that moves it. Keep the old gods, keep the crypt, but change the table where you sit so there are more chairs. Her lips tightened and softened again. And who will deal with the houses when they refuse? We tell them that their banners are cloth, he said. We tell them the winter comes whether they believe it or not. We tell them that if their people will not feed them, their swords will rust. She stared at him until the lines around her eyes became the physical measure of all she had seen. They will say you mean to unmake the Starks. The Starks were here before there were crowns, he said quietly. They kept their people alive through winters no Southron songs can imagine. We can do the same, and if there is no Stark on a raised seat, a Stark can still tend the fires. He thought of their father and the quiet ways he had moved, the refusals he had issued without volume. A man could govern a room by how he listened. Let the North be guarded by a Stark who does not bind the hands of those who feed her. Sansa's gaze dropped for a breath to the stone between them. When she looked back, her eyes had a light in them. And what do you call this, if not madness? Mercy, he said. Not Mummer's mercy, where a lord pardons a blameless thief to seem good. Mercy that is a bargain offered to every man, your voice for your obedience. Make them co-authors of their fate. It will quiet more blades than any gallows. She began to move then, just slightly from foot to foot, as if weighing the room's weight on her spine. You ask me to give away what I have made. I ask you to make something that will outlast both of us. Her mouth flattened again, and then a breath he did not know she had been holding left her in a shiver that might have been the ghost of a laugh. I should have known, she said. If you had wanted power, you would never have frightened me. The smile that came went as quickly as snow off a warmed stone. The houses will have to be called. The city will have to be fed while you all talk. You will make bylaws and bylaws for the bylaws until we have no grain. You will argue whether a fishwife's voice weighs the same as a lord's. While you invent your words, the winter will be in our kettles. I have thought of that, Jon said, and when her eyebrow rose, he knew how little experience with men who had thought ahead she'd been left by the last decade. White Harbor has stores. Wyman's son will deal for more with Braavosi if we show them paper with the king's seal next to yours. The Manderleys love coin and honor in equal measure. We'll fix tithe rates and weight of loaves. We'll keep the army lean and on the move. We'll set a messenger's road from Barrowton to the Shivering Sea. We'll build little things first. And we'll build more on their back. She was quiet a long time. Yo, you said you would wear what is needed, she said, and the words had turned in her like a hook. Do not return me a world where I am widow of the North. I have taken too many steps backward in dresses that still smelled of smoke. I will not leave you alone, Jon said. Not in this. Her eyes softened, and he remembered the girl who had sewn him a cloak with uneven stitches and smiled like summer. You will be judged, she said with no pity, by those who have waited too long to judge anyone. I know, and you will let yourself be judged. I will, and if they punish you, you will not run to the wall and hide. He looked down at his hands. No. Good, she said. Then she extended her hand over the bench, palm down, her fingers pale and dry like carved wood. He had thought she would offer him a sister's clasp. Instead, she offered him a queen's. He took it. The skin was cool. When he let go, he felt lighter and heavier at once, as if he had traded a pack for a sled. They sent ravens that night and the night after. Maester Wolkan scratched until his wrists cramped and cursed softly in the careful, respectful way that men who have served many masters learn. Letters went to Deepwood Motte, to Barrowton, to White Harbor, to the Umbers who remained in their new holdfast south of the broken last hearth, to the Karstarks in their partial, difficult return. Ravens went to Bear Island, where the women still ruled and the ground made no allowances for pretty fools. Ravens went to smaller places the songs didn't bother with, to Cinderfield and Glover's outlying farms, to Skagos. One bird, white and hawkish with blood in its feathers, went to Eastwatch by the sea and the ruined places beyond. The words were not poetic. Jon was not a poet. They said, "Come speak for yourselves." The first who came were the curious. White Harbor sent men fat with bread and gold who had opinions ready and the leisure to hold them. Alice Karstark came with a guard that moved like stone in a sling. The men of Barrowton sent Lady Dustin's steward. The lady herself chose to let the world come to her and not the other way around. The Glovers sent no one and wrote a letter which said nothing in a day's writing. The Mormonts came in a boat that needed caulking and none of them thought to ask help before someone offered. The free folk came in steps and in lines that were not lines, laughing as they took their first looks at a castle and telling it to go fuck itself in the same breath. Their words were sharp and their eyes were frank. They treated halls like weather. Tormund told the Great Hall that it would not fall down because he had rested his arse in it, and all good things bent if he sat on them. It was an unruly feast, because the North did not know how to do orderly except in war, and then the order had been fear. The cooks made stews that could serve the body of a cat and the reach of a hungry arm. The mead that came up from the cellars was good and not too sweet. The talk spun into knots and then broke like ice. It would have been easier, Jon thought, to let the old ways grind on and on, a mill that turned bones into dust. But that was the way things die without anyone noticing. Better to make something that could break than keep something that had already broken and pretend it had not. They began in the yard. Jon had Wolken scratch out what he meant. The first plain rules toward a body that would meet and hammer out whatever came next. Each village to send two, chosen by vote and not by stern eye. Each house to send one, no more, no less, even if the house bore a name that had owned halls and hell for centuries. The free folk to send speakers by counting tents and adding one for every 20, men or women as they chose, and no one to tell them what their hair ought to do. The watch to be given a single vote, because the watch, when it had remembered itself, had always been the realm's conscience and not its sword. Anyone with coin enough to bribe a voice to be thrown out in public. It was not elegant. It was the kind of thing you sand after you build it, so you do not catch your hand on it when you walk by. Sansa stood by his shoulder and said nothing until Alice Karstark stepped forward and said, "By what law do we do this?" "By the law we are making," Jon said, and she smiled like a woman who had found the edge of his knife. "A law that is not yet a law," she said. "I could like that." Manderley's men frowned and had quick conversations with their hands hiding their mouths. The Bear Island women said, "We'll send 3 because we do both kinds of work." And when Jon said no, 2, they said, "Fine, and we'll remember." The free folk shouted and laughed and made 2 lists and then tore them up and made one. The small folk looked afraid and thrilled. They were not used to being asked for anything but their backs and their sons. At dusk, Jon went to the Godswood. It was the only place the noise did not own. The heart tree watched him with its red tears and did not approve or disapprove. It had seen men make worse use of themselves. He knelt and laid his palm against the ridged trunk. It was warm. Sometimes living things pretended to be stone in this world. The leaves whispered like a shut mouth learning to open. "Help me," he said. And he meant the tree but also his father and also the ghost of the man whose name he had learned too late to keep. "Keep me from the kind of mistake that doesn't know itself." Footsteps came across the leaf litter like snow falling, tiny and relentless. Sansa stood at the edge, her cloak pulling light out of the gloom. "They are saying," she said, "that the Bear Islanders will use this to push us all back into the sea." "They always say that," Jon answered without opening his eyes. "They are saying the Manderleys will by the votes they can't earn. That too. They are saying Lady Dustin will simply not recognize this new hall, and she will go on doing as she pleases in her Barrow lands. She will," Jon said, opening his eyes at last, "until she tires of being alone with her barrows. That could take a long time, Sansa said dryly. It could. She came closer, light steps not quite touching the blood-red leaf that had fallen just so on a root like a knuckle. And what do they say about you? She asked. That I am a bastard playing at being less than a king, Jon said. That I murdered a queen. That I murder what I love. That I love what I should not. And what do you say? He looked up at the carved eyes and thought of a dragon dying with a sound like a mountain cracking, of a girl laughing over a cup, of a boy whose last word had been a joke. I say, he said slowly, that if they stand here under these leaves and say those things to my face, then this is working. On the second day, a man pushed out of the crowd with a shout. He had gloves stitched out of 2 different leathers and a mouth like a trap into which his own words had bitten too often. Traitor, he cried, and a dozen hands went to hilts. Traitor twice over. You killed the Dragon Queen and you killed the other when you put your back to a wall and let them stab you in the name of love. How many times do we forgive you? Jon could not breathe for a moment. The world narrowed to that man's mouth and the swords lifting like harvest scythes. He raised one hand and the movement froze more men than a wall of pikes. How many times should a man be forgiven? He said, not loudly. For living. None. The man spat. Then cut me down, Jon said, and could not tell if the beating of his heart was fear or relief. He stepped forward until the man's breath hit his cheek. I will not run. He turned his head and he saw Sansa not move. Her stillness was like a lesson. But if you do it, he said, turning back, do it not to prove that you can. Every man can kill. Do it because what I've said is wrong. Tell me that letting a potter speak for his road is wrong. Tell me that letting a widow speak for her tax is wrong. Tell me that giving the watch a voice is wrong. Tell me that the old gods do not want the living to talk under their leaves. If you can prove that, then kill me before they do more harm. The man's jaw worked. The swords creaked as hands clenched. Tormund boomed a laugh that rolled across the yard like a bear scratching its back on a tree. He's a fool, Tormund shouted. But he's our fool. The man lowered his gloves. The moment passed like a fever breaking. Jon took a breath that felt like the first one of a second life. Afterward, Wolkan told him in a dry voice that had a tremor like a tiny bird's wing beating in it. You mustn't do that very often. We only get so many gasps before we die. Noted, Jon said. They set to the work as if they had all stuck their hands into a beehive and decided to wrangle honey out of it despite the stings. Delegates were chosen in small rooms and at crossroads and on the Hive at White Harbor where the fish smell kept everyone honest. In some places it took 4 tries because the same men wanted to make the same old selections until the women rehearsed their own wrath. In one village the men chose a shepherd girl who had never left the ridge. In another the free folk sent an older man named Bor who kept forgetting to listen because he was so excited to speak and had to be reminded that doing both was a trick survivable only by elder gods and good cooks. The watch sent a ranger whose beard looked like he had woven it out of last year's sour hay and whose eyes missed nothing. His name was Jax and he smiled rarely and warmly. The day the assembly met for the first time, the hall was a weather of faces. The long tables had been scrubbed smooth and set back to make a circle. Men had set their asses on their opinions and women had sharpened theirs like knives. Both kinds sat now under the same roof and found they had to look across at each other. Jon felt as nervous as he had the first time he needed to ask a question of a man whose answer meant life. He seated himself with Davos to one side, his stillest, bravest friend, and Sansa to the other. He had insisted on that, and she had pretended to resist for show and then accepted because she was wiser than he sometimes believed he could bear. Alice Karstark raised a hand. Before we talk bread, she said, we should talk fences. Who keeps what inside where? First the charter. Manderley's man objected, jowls wobbling like pudding. Who are we and how shall we be called? The North, said a fisherwoman before anyone else could name the thing. Called that for as long as I've been alive. She had no idea she had made history by refusing to make words that would harden too soon. They argued sense into the lines. They argued nonsense out of them. They found that all sorts of questions wanted to sneak through the door. They beat them back gently. They wrote in the right to assemble twice each year if travel allowed and once if it did not, and the right to send messengers to Winterfell every month with questions and answers both. They wrote that no man's word was law unless it had been read aloud under the leaves of a tree, any tree, by someone who had eaten the bread that law would bake. They wrote that a man might leave his hold for the space of 5 winters and return to his name after if his name had not been taken for murder or desertion. They wrote that a woman could own land under her own name and keep it even if she married, and the Bear Islanders laughed and said, "Welcome to the age of the fish finding water." They wrote that free folk could settle on fallow farms and could keep the stock they wintered and the children they made, and that their old feuds were extinguished at the Winterfell gates. Any who sought blood for a blood taken on the other side of the wall would be punished like thieves who had robbed a man of sleep. They wrote that a first steward would be elected for 2 years and D would have the hands to carry out the assembly's will, to maintain the roads, to call the levy if monsters came. They said it calmly. They had learned not to think it impossible, to buy grain when grain failed and to sell it when the world went gold mad. The first steward would be answerable to the assembly and could be dismissed by a 2/3 vote. It was Wolkan who suggested the fraction and who said he would move to Dorne if they adopted the habit of throwing out their baker every week. They spoke the words aloud beneath the heart tree in a ceremony that was not a ceremony until Sansa stepped forward and placed her crown on the flat of the new table for a breath and lifted it again and set it on her head. "I am not less for this," she said, and her voice shook and steadied. "I am made of the people who stand beneath this roof." There were men who bit their tongues so they would not cheer. It would have been easy to make it a triumph. They made it quieter. It would go deeper that way. Letters came from King's Landing, slim as knives. The first was from Samwell, written in a hand that had learned to hide its delight in learning behind all the squareness a Grand Maester's ring demanded. He had heard whispers, he was listening. He sent congratulations and asked, in a paragraph that spilled like a drunk down a stair, whether they had considered annuities for widows. "He thinks of widows because he is not made into a shape that can ignore them," Davos said, grinning around his spoon. "Gods keep him." The second letter was from the king's hand, a scrap that said only, "This is the way the wooden gods remember." It had no signature because it did not need one. Not all was warmth. In the 3rd month, word came north of a troop of Sellswords from the Riverlands who had slithered like eels into the Dreadfort's broken vaults and were using the place to tax trade on the White Knife by taking goods at arrow point. They called their captain Kedge Ironhand because his right arm ended in a clasp of metal with a hook he had learned to use like a second mouth. He had a laugh that carried and a cruelty that did not. He was not clever, but he had enough rage to make up for some of it. He sent a message to Winterfell that said, "I recognize no laws but my own," and sealed it with grease. Jon rode east with a mixed company. Free folk who wanted the old red walls looted and burned down to a memory you couldn't find in a song, Manderly men who wanted their tolls back, Karstarks who wanted to fight because that was the one thing that kept their blood from tasting of rust. Sansa stayed. She had learned the worth of being seen when she did not move. Davos went because Davos never held still when people were starving and bandits grew fat. Jacks of the Watch came too, silent and warming to Jon the way a fire you did not notice was warming you until you realized you could take off a layer. They went fast because they had to and because horses liked to run when the air was cold and the ground remembered its stiffness. Tormund told 3 stories a day and a 4th at night that had more wrong swears than right. They found the Dreadfort with its pitch-black windows and its memory of flayed men that clung to the stone like a second skin. The walls were not what they had been, but a desperate man with high stones is an equation in his favor even when you carry better math. Jon rode to the gate and asked to speak. Kedge Ironhand came out ringing with his own importance. The iron appendage clutched in leather so it would not freeze to the stone. He wore his hair in a sad imitation of a lord's tail. "You're the wolf who thinks he's a sheep," the man said. "Do you knock down my house, wolf?" "It was never yours," Jon said. And he had not meant to say it, but the words rose out of his chest like birds. "You can come out and be judged, or you can wait in there until your men grow sick and I cut them down as they try to climb out. Or you can choose something else." Kedge blinked at that. He had prepared himself to be dared, not offered. "What else?" he asked, suspicious. "You come out and bend the knee," Jon said. "Not to me, to the assembly. You and your men will swear to serve as road guards for a year and a day. You'll rebuild the East Watchtower and keep fires there whenever the night comes early. You'll restore what you took, by labor if not coin, and I will see that your names are not used as curses in the mouths of frightened children. Kedge spat. And if I say no? Then the men behind me from Bear Island will come over your wall like weather, John said. And you will die without a story worth telling. He turned aside to show that he did not need the answer, because a man who isn't hungry controls the terms of his dinner. He waited while the silence grew a second skin. Jax's breath made a thin line of smoke near his horse's mane. Davos stood with one hand on the strap of his saddle. His face half turned to listen to some idiot bird in a tree. John could feel Ghost's heat at his knee. He did not pray because this was not a place gods loved. In the end, Kedge laughed. It was a smaller sound than it had been before. You're very fine, you with your words, he said. He raised the iron hook and scratched his neck with it, a gesture that in a better man might have been a tick. Open the gate, he shouted without looking toward the men on the parapet. The gate creaked and jawed open. John had not expected that feeling to go through him, relief sharpened by terror. He handed the moment gently to the men behind him and went forward at the walk. When he reached Kedge, he took the man's forearm with his own and pressed. It was a soldier's handshake, and it made Kedge look stupefied. 1 year and a day, John said. If you make of it a joke, if you take one basket that's not yours, we will find you so quickly your grandchildren will feel the wind of us. But if you keep your oath, your grandchildren will be able to sell onions without fear. He did not realize until later that he had said grandchildren twice. Kedge almost cried. He had no grandchildren. He had too much of his life left unmended. I bent the knee to worse men, he said. I can do it for a year. They set guards and torches and moved on. Kedge did what he had said he would. That was the miracle and the joke. One of his men tried to steal a cart of barley flour, and Kedge beat him himself in front of the watchtower, then gave him stew and wept afterward where no one could see. People change in strange pieces. John knew better than to trust it, but he also knew better than to refuse the gift of an enemy choosing not to be one. When he came back to Winterfell, he fell into bed and slept longer than he had meant to and woke to the sound of voices in the corridor like water over stones. Sansa stood by his bed when he opened his eyes, and she was smiling. He tensed. Good news had always felt like a trap. What now? He asked thickly. You missed the first real insult hurled in the hall, she said. You'll regret it all your life. At his look, she relented. They've agreed to hold the first election for the first steward in 3 months' time, she said, the words setting out cups in her mouth. When the roads are clear enough that no one can claim fiction to keep from voting. Davos proposed it, and Wolkan almost cried. The Bear Islanders voted yes because they like anything that promises to make trouble. Manderley's men voted yes because they fancy they can win. The Free Folk voted yes because they want to put a man named Dog Eater in the chair. The Small Folk voted yes because they wanted to say yes to something with their whole breaths. Her face shifted. Who do you think they will choose? Not me, John said. If they have any sense at all. Sense, Sansa repeated. That's the thing we're growing here. The choosing grew into a season. Delegates went home with lists of names they had gathered and returned with more names and with arguments to match. They held little debates under branches that remembered drips and under caravan wheels and in kitchens where someone stirred porridge while 3 men called each other liars and 4 women corrected them. They came to Winterfell in snow and in thaw and in that sharp, new green that made your bones ache with the memory of being young. Men put their coats over benches and small children fell asleep in the corners with jam on their hands while their mothers circled the candidates like hawks. Tormund declared for Dog Eater and then, when it turned out that Dog Eater was not a name but an occupation, declared for a weaver of nets from near Widow's Watch who turned out to be shy. Davos's name came up and he laughed them down and said he had a ship's worth of work and no belly for the chair. Manderley's men put up a nephew with skin that looked like milk and a smile that had cost someone money. Alice Karstark named a woman from Barrowton who had very little to say and every word had muscle. The Free Folk named Bor, and then Bor forgot what he was saying in the middle of a sentence and changed his mind to support a woman named Fen who was missing 2 fingers and had more sense than a prayer. The Watch nominated Jax, and Jack said he'd do it if they made him, but he'd prefer to keep his boots on. It was chaos, and it was better than any feast John had ever seen. In the evenings he sat by the fire with Ghost's head heavy on his boot and listened to Davos and Tormund throw insults that polished each other's edges. Sansa sat across the room with Wolken and drew up a schedule that would make a siege master cry. In the mornings, Jon walked the yard and felt eyes on his back. They watched for him to grab the reins he had laid in the straw. He did not. He spoke when asked. When not asked, he listened. It became a habit that ate his fear and built a new thing in its place, something you could live inside without hating it. Then a raven brought a letter from Lady Dustin, composed in a hand as neat as a blade slipping between ribs. It said, in 3 clean lines, that she declined the invitation of any assembly that valued her steward's voice equal to that of a woman who had never commanded a man in her life. She means, Sansa said blandly, that she is not coming because she is not leading the procession. Should we go to her? Jon asked. We should let wind and the lack of news do the walking, Sansa said. When the roads in her lands go to mud because no one calls crews to lay stone, she will ask who decides where the stone goes. When she hears the name of a place that is not Barrowton, we will see what else she declines. I am content to let her starve on her own pride if that is what she is hungry for. She did not say that she had learned this from someone with lemon cakes on his breath and a knife in his ledger. It was all right. They had both learned from men who were gone. The election day broke with light so clear you could have cut it and eaten it raw. They crowded into the hall, into the gallery, into the places where the sound climbed into the beams and built nests. They had made slates with the names. Wolken had devised a method with pebbles and clay bowls that even a man who had been hit on the head by a mule could not misread. They explained it twice, slowly, while Tormund yawned loudly on purpose to make them speed up. Sansa stood on the dais, not higher than a man's eyes, and spoke the first words and then sat down with her hands folded and did not move. It was a trick Jon admired. He had suspected Bor would come close because the free folk had decided to act like the assembly belonged to them and their voices carried. But Bor himself was uncomfortable with the idea of sitting when he could stand, and that hurt him among those who liked their stewards to stay put. Manderly's boy got more stones than anyone expected because money had a way of making itself understood, and Alice Karstark's woman from Barrowton surprised everyone by drawing the room into her when she spoke as if she were pulling rope hand over hand. In the end, they put the pebbles in the bowls and counted again for form and because it felt good to count when the thing you were counting had weight. Fen of the Free Folk was chosen. Fen with her 2 missing fingers, who did not wear a lord's braid and did not bow and spoke men's names like promises they had not yet kept. She looked sick when Wolken announced it. She looked like a woman who had stood too fast. Then she straightened and turned and looked not at Jon and not at Sansa but at the room as if it were a beast and she would have to learn its habits. I'll need help, she said, and when she said it as her first words in office, something in the hall exhaled. And I'll give it too. It should not have mattered who won. The thing was the choosing, but it mattered that it was her. It said to men who had counted their names before they counted their worth that the counting had changed. It said to women who had kept bread lines from breaking that the room had seen it. It said to Jon that the world had shifted on its axis and not fallen to pieces. The first season under Fen was equal parts mud and iron. She spent her mornings with a board on which stones stood for roads and her afternoons with farmers who had never been asked for advice and who gave it with the bluntness of men who did not have a habit of wrapping their ideas in silk. She sent crews to the moors where carts sank every spring and to the ford on the Lethe where Manderly's men had been quietly taxing anyone who could not swim with their wares. She redrew the levy lists so that no man would be pulled from a hut where 3 children had rickets unless all other huts had given a man first. She caught a moneylender from White Harbor buying a vote with cloth. She made him stand in the yard and tell the story of the intrusion to every man and woman who came through the gate for 2 days and 2 nights, then banished him to the south for 5 years. Men called it lenient. Jon called it a lesson with the right weight. It would hold. Trouble did not leave them because they had made new rules for it to follow. Took on different shapes. A gang of men who called themselves kingsmen for a king, who did not rule here, began to harry small settlements and set up a prayer fire outside a village where 7 carved faces stared out of the bark with sanctimony. Sansa called it drift from the south. Jon called it anger looking for a reason. Fen called them to Winterfell and offered to hear what they had to say. When they would not come, she sent Jax with a paper that had 3 sentences on it and a seal that was only half impressed because the wax had set too fast. Said, "Come speak. We listen. If not, go and do it now." When they did neither, Tormund went in the night and stole their fire for them. He left a note in his crude letters that said, "Your God can find you better flame if he wants you at this work." In the morning the men were gone. The winter eased on them with gentler hands than it might have. The stores in White Harbor reached a little further because people believed their own voices might refill them. Sometimes faith works on the belly. On the worst nights, Jon woke sweating at the memory heat of Dragon's breath and went to stand in the yard until the air made needles in his chest. Ghost leaned against his thigh with an old dog's quiet and a young wolf's need. Jon would put his hand between the wolf's ears and feel the skull plates as if reading the fate there. He was afraid sometimes that the people would see the Targaryen in him like a bruise that had not faded. And yet when the small folk spoke of him now they said, more often than not lord, not king, not bastard, but man who listens. It made him unsteady. He thought he preferred fear. He did not, but the habit of it lies. In the spring Arya came like weather you had read about and could not explain. She was thinner than he remembered and stronger yet. She had a map she had drawn on sailcloth with ink that had run in rain and a story about birds that had flown beyond the sunset and yet returned. She had a look in her eyes like the part of the woodland where the road never reached. She listened to the hall until midnight and then pulled Jon into the crypts and made him laugh, the first real laugh he had let out since the last time she shoveled snow onto him as a boy. "You made yourself into something that breathes," she said, skeptical and proud. "I helped make a thing," he said, stubborn. And she rolled her eyes and jabbed him with 2 fingers in the muscle of his arm. "That's what I said," she told him. In the morning she was gone again. After leaving Sansa a knife and Fen a net mended with neat, ugly knots. It had never been in Arya to stay. The North made kinds of women that some songs could not carry. In the 2nd year of the assembly, there was a famine scare when a blight took half the barley in the southern fields. Fen stood on the table and said, "We will not let this be one man's famine and another man's feast." She sent riders to White Harbor with orders to buy grain from the Reach and pay with wintercraft, furs, wood, ore, and with the promise of a river free of petty robbery. She sent other riders to the Fingers with a letter to the Eyrie asking for seed and for news of storms, and to the king with a request for a loan that she did not name a loan because pride had to be managed both up and down. Sansa taught her how to tie a letter so it said what it meant without making a man who could say no feel cornered. The grant came, with Bran still writing its own kind of mercy across the lines. It was not only the people who changed. Winterfell changed too. The great hall's echoes lost some of their dominance. They were replaced by the sound of benches being moved, of maps being weighted by stones that had been carried in hands that had slid a bowstring and milked a cow and buried a daughter. The yard learned new paths as men and women walked them. The gods would develop the habit of being the end of conversations instead of the beginning. People came there to turn what they had said into something they could hold. The ravens grew muscular in their wings. There were more of them. They had work. They did not sing any more than they had before, but their silence meant something new. In the 3rd year, the assembly elected a 2nd steward and told Fen to take a seat and breathe. He was a blacksmith sister named Rowena with rough hands and a way of speaking as if she were hammering and had to judge her blows. Light, then precise, then heavy. She looked at the road stones and the papers left by Fen and said, "It is good. It is not enough," and set to making bridges across small streams that had murdered carts for 10 years. She had a way with men who had learned to resist. She did not push. She moved beside calmly, as if there were only one direction to go and it was obvious. Jon found himself unnecessary. It was a sensation like stepping onto ice that held. He did what he had learned to do. He listened and he spoke when asked. He rode to places that still did not believe their names had been called, and he took them the proof. Pieces of paper with a seal and a feeling. He settled disputes, not like a lord, throwing weight, but like a man who had learned that sometimes sitting with two angry people who hated each other and staying as long as their breath lasted was the only way that breath would shorten. When men asked him for an answer, he asked them a question. It made them angry. It made them look at themselves. Some of them learned to like it the way a man learns to like bitter tea because it sharpens his tongue. Once, because lessons repeat themselves until men learn them, a man lunged at him in a gathering outside last hearth skeleton. The man had lost scribbled all over his face. A wife 3 years dead, a son who had gone south and not returned, a cow that had bloated in spring and burst. He stumbled and his knife flashed. John took the arm, twisted it, and let the knife fall. He could have driven the man to the ground and called out the law in a big voice. He pulled the man to his feet instead and stood 3 inches away, breathing his air. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me why you thought a knife would bring you more than a voice." The man sobbed out his words like a boy. John stood there and took them. When the man was done, John turned to the assembly, who were all watching because men do not turn away from the moment when a body might be made to pay. "Is there a man here," he asked, "who has not wanted to use a knife when a voice would do? Is there a woman here who has not learned that a knife is not heard?" No one answered. He nodded, and they made a penalty for men who brought blades to where law was being made. It involved digging ditches, not losing hands. People talked about it for days. Felt like a victory, which meant it probably was. The South watched with a bemused, hungry curiosity, the way wealthy men watch poor ones who have invented a new way to be dignified. Letters came, some acid, some thick with praise that was its own test. A lord in the Riverlands wrote to ask whether he could borrow fen to teach his men how to stop taking pigs. A woman in the Crownlands wanted their charter because she thought she might speak it under a tree near her house and make her husband listen to it. Sam wrote 3 pages about a notion for public schools that did not sound like brothels. Sansa stroked the quill slow afterward and said, "He will change the South if they let him." And John thought that maybe they would not, and maybe he would do it anyway. Bran sent a square of parchment with 4 words on it. "Men keep choosing together." It was like a God's good night. One evening in the 4th year of the Assembly's life, when the sunset had stained the stones a color like raw salmon and the air had the warmth of stew, Sansa came to find Jon in the crypts. She moved as if she knew which stone would shift, as if the place had taught her to walk. She stopped in front of their father's stone and put her hand on her own cold face there. There was comfort in talking to a version of yourself that had not yet learned pain. "Arya has sent another map," she said. "She says there are lands beyond the lands we know and a forest where the trees are white not from snow. She says we are soft here." "We are," Jon said. "Soft is not always an insult." He looked at the faces on the old stones. He felt their scrutiny like a madman's breath. "We used to be hard and wrong. Maybe we are soft and right. Sometimes." Sansa's mouth moved in that smile he knew. "You want to go," she said. "I want to stay," he answered. Surprised him that it was true. "All my life I wanted to run. I wanted to run from the name I had and the names I learned. Now, I want to see what comes next." He thought of Fen and Rowena and of whoever would come next, and of the crowd that would yell quietly for them, and he felt something like pride that did not hurt. Sansa looked at him, and something unclenched in her that had been tight since the day she learned that beautiful things lie. "Do you remember?" she said, her voice like bread torn open. "When we were children and I took the last honey cake and you looked at me like I had committed a crime?" "I looked at you like you were a queen," Jon said. "I was right. The wrong kind of queen then, the right kind now." She laughed then, a sound that made the dead kinder. "Stay until spring," she said. "Then go north and see the Watch if you like. See how they are doing with their one voice. You will not find many men in black. They have learned to be keepers of fires." "I will go," he said, "and come back." And so it was. He went that spring with Ghost and with Jax and with SM. All packet of salt for a man on a hill who had saved Jon's life once. The wall was a line across the world that had learned humility. Eastwatch had gaps and Castle Black had mended its teeth. The men who wore black now wore it because someone had to, not because it was a form of running. They had a kiln where they fired tiles for roofs. They had a field where they tried to teach barley to live in sand with seaweed for meat. They had 2 boys who thought it was grand to sleep where the wind sang like mischief. John sat in the mess and ate the stew that had never changed, and he told them what had worked and what had not, and he listened as if these men were a parliament. They were. When he turned north of the wall and walked a day, the forest said his name in its own way, which was always no words and all wind. He left a piece of himself there as he always had. He took less with him each time, which made the leaving easier. On his return he found Winterfell full of argument again, which meant it was healthy. Rowena was stepping down and would sit for another woman named Thistle, who had a temper like a bell but hands that soothed. Fen had grown old in the face. She walked with a cane a boy had carved for her, with wolves' heads on it. "You were right," she said to John without greeting. "It holds. It holds," he agreed. He put his hand on the table and felt the scratches there from a long winter evening when someone had carved their child's name to see it survive. He imagined names from after he was gone. It did not fill him with dread. He was tired. It was the kind of tired that you can nap in. One night he climbed the outer wall and stood where the wind found all the seams in a man's coat. Winterfell was a beast asleep under him, warm, breathing, at peace with its bones. In the yard 2 men were arguing about which kind of sled runs best behind a small pair of oxen, and in the kitchen someone sang off-key, and in the hall a new line was being read aloud for the charter with the comfort of repetition. "No man who speaks under a tree shall be silenced by a sword." He closed his eyes and heard Daenerys's voice in some memory saying impossible things about a world made new, and he felt as if he had carried a piece of her promise without committing the sin of burning anyone with it. He opened his eyes and watched the lamp in Sansa's window go out. The stars were a thin scatter. He thought of Bran with his eyes too old, listening to ravens whose minds were weather. He thought of Arya on a ship that had found a wind that had never been named. He did not feel forgiven. He did not believe in a forgiveness that came as a blanket. He believed in the kind that came as a daily loaf. He believed in warm stew and in law spoken aloud. He believed in benches. He believed in a woman with 2 fingers missing holding a seal and trying to make herself worthy of it, and in a blacksmith's sister lifting a stone out of a cart because no man else could without breaking his back. He believed in a free folk boy in new boots choosing to load a stranger's shovelful of gravel onto his own shoulder, as if the world were simply a place where you shifted weight until it was bearable. The North did not become paradise. It did not forget how to be cruel, but the cruelties were smaller and had to explain themselves as they had not been asked to before. A man who beat his wife for raising her voice was dragged into the hall by 3 neighbors and made to face a room that would hear him and her both. A merchant who sold rotten apples to a village at double cost had his wares thrown into the snow one afternoon and was told to bring better and to mind his digits. Sickness came and was fought not with prayer alone but with clean water in a bucket and by moving the sick to a warm place where the air was passed through clean cloth. Famine licked around the door and was sent away with a plan written in careful hand that said everything a man could want to know about the rate at which a cart can move barley when half the road is mud. One day a man from south of the neck, wrapped in the kind of cloak that said he could pay for more warmth, came to stand at the edge of the assembly and watched. He went away with his mouth working. John imagined the first law he would propose when he got home. He smiled without malice. He had become a man capable of that. Ghost grew old under his hand and then older, which is a trick men can only write and wolves can perform. When he went at last, he did it like a creature whose work had been done, and John buried him behind the godswood where the warm earth sighed and took him without complaint, and John put his head against the red trunk and heard tears creak inside it. Sansa came and stood without speaking and then laid a hand on his shoulder that weighted him to the world in the way a hand can when love has been made into a place rather than a plan. "He was the best of us," she said, and John thought so, and neither of them found the need to name the others. Years passed in the manner that healthy years do, not remarking on themselves except in the count of births and the slow upgrade of roofs. Children grew up knowing that to sulk about a law was to be invited to listen to it and to be asked what they might make better. Songs, being the lazy beasts they are, learned to insert the word moots between verses about swords so that they did not have to invent entirely new skull-rattling melodies. Men still killed each other over women and meat. They did it with less ceremony and fewer flags, and when they were brought into the hall afterward, they were not killed in turn if someone could find a way to make the village whole again with labor. The Bear Islanders never stopped insisting they could row faster than anyone else and never stopped being right. The Manderleys never stopped trying to buy the votes they could not win and became better citizens for being slapped publicly each time. It taught them new skills. John grew lined and quieter. He climbed fewer stairs. He listened better. He went beyond the wall again twice and came back both times with a new story and colder hands. He rode to Skagos once to broker a peace about sheep that had become a peace about old insults and a marriage that surprised everyone by working. He wrote letters and learned to sign his name with a hand that did not shake. He laughed, and each laugh had a place to fall now that did not echo endlessly down a corridor. He forgot Daenerys one whole morning, and when he remembered her, he put his hand against the scent of her in his skull and did not flinch. One evening he dreamed of the dragon with blue eyes that had flown over the wall and killed the house of his boyhood, and he woke with the taste of ice in his blood, and he went out into the yard and stood and saw the lamps in the windows and thought, "We built something that dragons cannot burn." He hoped it was true. He did not marry. He received offers like a man receives news of rain. They were expected and sometimes welcome and more often simply the world being the world. He loved in quiet ways that the songs would not bother with. A woman he sat with one winter while her child lay sick. A man whose sheep he helped track in summer until they found them in bracken, stupid and fine. Fen, whose hand he held the day she died, her head leaning onto his shoulder as if death were a nap she had earned. He did not count these loves as a ledger he was trying to balance. He did not forget what he had done on a pile of white stones in a city that had been made into ash. He carried that. He carried it alongside the other things. He did not ask for absolution. He took responsibility like a coat and he wore it, and it kept him from cold part of the time. When at last he knew that he had fewer days ahead than behind and did not find this an offense, he went to the Godswood alone and sat with his back against the tree and the smell in the air like iron made tender. He listened. The leaves sighed. The voices from the hall drifted to him. The repeat of the charter in a young girl's halting voice as she learned the cadence that would become a lullaby for her daughter. He had thought once that peace would be a silence that pressed on the ears. It wasn't. It was the manageable hum of useful things. It was a man mending a net while a woman browned onions, and a child practicing a speech without knowing she was practicing. It was a road being rolled. It was a bench dragged to make room for one more. He felt a hand then, which was a wind, which was his father's hand, which was the present disguised as memory. It pressed once, not to absolve and not to restrain and not to chastise, only to say, "We made this. We made it imperfect and in pieces, and it will outlast us, and that is the only way that anything worth the word mercy has ever existed." John stood, his knees a touch stiff, and brushed leaf dust from his breeches. He walked toward the hall where the voices pooled, and when he came into the light there were shadows thrown behind him of 1,000 leaves. He took his place not at the head of the circle but in it. He raised a hand to ask a question, and men and women turned toward him not because he was a lord or a king but because they had learned that listening and being listened to are the same labor. There was bread on the table. There were stones marking roads. There were names written in poor hands and neat. There was the North making law with its own mouth, and there was a man in it, breathing. A long time ago he had been told that love was the death of duty, and then that duty was the death of love. Here, at last, he had found that mercy, which is only love made into work, could rename both and take the teeth out of their fighting. He smiled a little and spoke. The room lifted to meet the words, and their answering came like the sea.